Mr. Yamaguchi, we have a couple short questions to ask you since you're visiting IE today. And the first one is related to what we know many people call the loss taken in Japan. The fact that Japan, after starting on the early 90s, where two bubbles burst, on the one hand the housing bubble, on the other hand the stock market. And lately with the world crisis, we're starting to see some people making comparisons between Japan and the loss taking and the situation today. So our question would be, do you think that these comparisons are relevant? To what extent there are similarities between what happened in Japan and what is happening now, or there are differences? And maybe are there any lessons that we should learn either on policies that should be applied or policies that should be avoided?
Well, I think this is a very good question, very important and relevant to the current economic development globally. I believe that all the financial crises have some common denominators, and every financial crisis is a little bit different from others. So there are things that are very common and familiar, and there are some differences as well. With respect to the common phenomenon, I find that the present financial crisis and the one we had back in 1990s both left behind the huge accumulation of debt in the private sector. These are very painful to be worked out, and unfortunately it took us so many years to resolve the debt crisis, partly because of the strong resistance among our politicians as well as the taxpayers to use taxpayers' money to bail out the financial system. In that respect, I would like to commend the policymakers and regulatory authorities in the United States and Europe and the UK for moving rather fast to inject such a substantial amount of money into the banking system. And I think that decision was absolutely necessary to stabilize the financial system that was at one time looked so dangerous. But having said that, I think it has to take years before the private debt accumulation, which I see both in the United States, in Europe and the UK, can arrive at a more manageable level. And until that days arrive on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, I think the policymakers have to remain rather vigilant, because the accumulation of huge debt in the private sector means that the private spending will have to be strongly constrained by the existing debt, which in turn would imply that economic recovery may not be so smooth. It may well be a rather bumpy process, and we may not see full stones, we still don't know. In other words, there is such a great uncertainty there on the horizon, and policymakers will have to be very careful in moving forward the so-called exit strategy. So these are, I think, the basic lessons that one can draw from the Japanese so-called lost decade.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yamaguchi. And then thinking a little bit more about the long term, we know there's been a lot of discussion in the world, not starting now with the crisis, but even before, about the emerging countries in China and India, Brazil, Russia, and others becoming more and more important in the world. So my question would be, on the same time, people talk about Asian century. It does seem to be a lot of reasons. There are a lot of reasons to think about this century being very important in Asia. So our question would be, to what extent do you anticipate that the balance of economic and political power is set to change in Asia and in the world? And for example, while Japan, we all know, continues to be the second economy in the world, China, we know, is growing very fast. So does this mean that probably in the future we will see in Asia like two economic locomotives coexisting at the same time and becoming engines of growth? What are your thoughts about the future of Asia and the world in terms of these?
Okay, among the so-called emerging economies in the world, I would like to focus on Asian emerging economies, particularly on China, which I believe is the most important of the so-called the big four, the BRIC countries. I think China's economic potential is still quite substantial. After all, the per capita income of the Chinese people is still around $3,000 US at market prices, which means that they still have a long, long way to go until they can catch up with the living standards that we see prevailing in the so-called Western world. Capital has been flowing in rather vigorously into China, providing good investment opportunities, both for the foreign capital as well as Chinese domestic capital. And I think that our history suggests that once an economy takes off, it has the capacity to grow continuously at a relatively rapid pace until it arrives at a certain stage of development. That is what happened in my country, in Japan, back in 1950s and 60s, almost a quarter century of rapid growth of around 10% per year, measured by real GDP. And I believe that since China started from a much lower ground to grow, to take off, China still has plenty of opportunity to grow. So China's growth potential is still very great, but China has very formidable challenges that it has to deal with in coming years. Even today, Chinese economic development is rapid, but on the other hand, the income discrepancy within China is expanding. And that is, I believe, one of the priority problems that the Chinese leadership will have to deal with in coming years. Another is that Chinese leaders have to think very carefully and very seriously how they can adapt themselves to the changing economic environment in the world. That is, given the size of the Chinese economy, China should think very carefully how they can be integrated in the global world without overly disrupting the existing order in the world. Which means, in my view, that the renminbi, the Chinese currency, will have to be managed more flexibly. For instance, Chinese trade may not be accepted by other countries to record huge surplus year by year. The Chinese authorities may want to move carefully with their investment abroad, and all these things are big challenges for China. I think that the same thing can probably be said of other big emerging economies, such as India, Russia, Brazil. So there are some common things that the big emerging economies have to think very carefully. But I would conclude that the Chinese future is bright, their growth capacity is very strong, and as you just mentioned, China is fast catching up with the Japanese economy And already measured by the so-called PPP, Chinese economy is already greater than the size of the Japanese. I would very much hope that the Japanese economy will be reinvigorated by a wave of innovations. And if we succeed in that efforts, as you say, we will likely have 2 locomotives in Asia, but that largely depends on what the Chinese and Japanese leadership and economic policies can accomplish in coming years.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Yamaguchi. It's a real pleasure to have you with you today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.